The wind arrived before the snow did. It came down from the high ridges like something alive. Not a gust, not a breeze, but a presence. It moved through the pines with a low, deliberate moan, bending the tallest branches toward the earth, as if pressing them into a bow. The horses in the far stable heard it first. They shifted and stamped, uneasy in ways that animals always are when the world is about to change. Inside a hollow cottonwood tree, a fire burned low and steady. 18 people pressed together in a space built for one. Children slept curled against strangers. Grown men sat with their knees drawn up, staring at walls of ancient wood that radiated a warmth no one in that room had expected to feel. Outside, the storm tore at the world. Inside, the air was still. The walls, 3 feet of living wood, patient and thick, held the cold at bay, the way a great stone holds the heat of the afternoon sun, long after the light has gone. And in the doorway of that impossible shelter stood a woman. She was not tall. She was not imposing. Her coat was worn at the elbows and her boots had been resoled twice. But she stood in that doorway with a stillness that made the people behind her go quiet, one by one, until even the children sensed it and stopped crying. Outside, a man stood in the snow. He was a large man. A man who had, not so long ago, told her that the land felt no grief for her. That neither did he. He said nothing now. He only looked at her, and she stepped aside. "Come in," Norah Vance said. "Get warm." That was the moment everyone in that hollow remembered for the rest of their lives. Not the storm, not the cold, not the night that nearly swallowed them whole. They remembered the way she stepped aside, the way she said it, not with triumph, not with bitterness, but with the simple authority of a woman who had already decided long before that knock came what kind of person she intended to be. But to understand that moment, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the day they put her things in the snow. It was the kind of cold that doesn't ask permission. It settled over the small mining settlement in the hills like a judgment. Absolute, indifferent, final. The sky had gone the color of old pewter 3 days before, and the older residents had looked at it with the expression of people who have seen that color before and know what it means. They said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. Norah had known the cold was coming. She had felt it in the way Everett pressed closer to her side at night, in the way the stray dog her son had been begging to keep curled tighter against the door each morning, his breath making small clouds in the air inside the cabin. But the cold outside was not what broke her that morning. It was the notice nailed to the door. She read it once, then she read it again, slowly. The way you read something when you are hoping the words will rearrange themselves into something bearable. They did not. Her husband had been a good man, a careful man. He had worked the same shaft for 4 years without complaint, sending home every dollar he could spare, keeping his tools clean, keeping his word. 3 weeks ago, the earth had decided that wasn't enough. A section of tunnel gave way without warning, the way such things do, suddenly and completely, and without any regard for the people inside it. And just like that, Norah was a widow in a company town, which meant she was nothing, which meant she had until sundown. The men who came to move her belongings were not cruel. That was almost worse. They were simply doing what they had been told, carrying out her few possessions with the quiet efficiency of men who had done this before and would do it again. A wooden chest, a cast iron stove, a rolled blanket, a box of her husband's tools. his name still scratched into the side of the handle case in letters she had watched him carve. Everett stood beside her in the doorway, 9 years old and very still. He didn't cry. He had her eyes, that watchful, measuring quality. And he used them now, looking at the settlement around them, at the windows of the nearest cabins, where curtains shifted and then went still. At the Reverend, standing at a distance with his hands folded, not approaching. At the foreman, who had delivered the notice himself, and now stood with his back to them, already moving on to the next task. "Mama," Everett said. "I know," Norah said. She put her hand on his shoulder. She kept it there. The foreman paused as he passed her. He had the grace, at least, to stop. He looked at her belongings in the snow, then at her face, and something moved behind his eyes. Not quite guilt, not quite pity, but something in the neighborhood of both. "There's a wagon heading east in a week," he said. "You could be on it." Norah said nothing. He walked away. She stood in the cold with her son and everything she owned piled in the snow around her. And she thought about her father. He had been a forester in the old country, a man who spent his life reading trees the way other men read books. He had taught her things that most people in this part of the world considered useless. How to read the grain of old wood. How to find water by watching where the moss grew thick. How to tell the difference between a tree that was dying and a tree that was simply hollow, and why those two things were not the same at all. "The oldest things know how to survive the longest, little starling," he used to say, "if you know how to look." She picked up the box of her husband's tools. She shifted through it quickly. There were things she needed and things she didn't, and she had learned already this morning that she could not carry everything. At the bottom of the box, beneath a folded cloth and a spare chisel, her fingers found paper. She pulled it out. It was a folded sheet, soft at the creases from age, the ink faded but still legible in most places. The handwriting was not her husband's. She had memorized every loop and angle of his hand over the years of letters and ledgers, and this was someone else entirely. An older hand, more deliberate, pressing harder into the paper as if the words needed to be held down. She read what she could. Most of it had blurred with time and damp, but the last line was clear. "The Cottonwood Canyon. It was always meant to be yours." She stared at it for a long moment. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket, close to her chest. She did not know what it meant. She did not know whose hand had written it, or when, or why it had been hidden at the bottom of her husband's tool case, where she might never have found it. But she kept it. She pulled Everett close and looked out toward the tree line at the edge of the settlement, toward the canyon she had walked through once, weeks ago, gathering deadfall for the fire. She had seen something there. A tree so old and wide, it had looked more like a feature of the landscape than a living thing. A tree she had recognized immediately from her father's descriptions, from the particular way the bark grew in great swirling patterns around its base. A hollow tree. Not a dead tree. Her father had been very clear about the difference. "Mama," Everett said. His voice was small. "Are we going to sleep inside a tree?" Norah looked down at him. She thought of her father's hands, the way he had pressed them flat against the bark of an ancient oak and closed his eyes, listening. The way he had smiled when he heard what he was listening for. "Your grandfather always said," she told her son, "that the oldest things know how to survive the longest." She adjusted the strap of the tool case on her shoulder. "Let's find out if he was right." They walked into the trees. Behind them, the curtains in the settlement windows stayed closed, but Norah Vance did not look back. The canyon was quieter than the settlement. That was the first thing Norah noticed. Not the cold, not the darkness gathering at the edges of the tree line, but the quiet. The settlement had always carried noise with it. The ring of tools against rock, the creak of wagon wheels, the low murmur of a community that talked about everything except the things that mattered. Out here, there was only wind moving through pine needles and the soft crunch of her own footsteps, and Everett's beside her. The cottonwoods stood at the far end of the canyon, where the walls of rock curved inward and sheltered a small flat clearing from the worst of the weather. Norah had seen it before, on that walk weeks ago, and she had thought then what she thought now, that it did not look like a tree so much as something the earth had pushed up from underneath, something that had been here long before the settlement and would be here long after. Its trunk was enormous, 12 feet across at the base, maybe more. The bark was deeply furrowed, silver gray and ancient, growing in great slow spirals that her father had taught her to read like text. She walked around it slowly, one hand trailing along the bark, feeling the way it curved away from her. On the leeward side, sheltered from the wind's main force, she found what she had hoped for: a fissure. Not large, barely wider than her shoulders at its widest point, but dark and deep, opening into the base of the tree like a doorway that had always been there, waiting. She knelt and looked inside. The smell that came out was cool and dry and ancient, earth and wood and something else, a stillness that had nothing to do with cold. She had smelled it before, in the forests of her childhood, pressed against her father's side as he showed her what most people walked past without seeing. "It's not rot," he had told her once, his voice low and certain. "Rot smells wet. Rot smells like ending. This is something else entirely. This is a tree that has made room." She pulled out the small tallow candle she had tucked into her coat pocket before leaving. Her hands were steady as she lit it. She had learned, very young, that panic was a luxury she could rarely afford, and she held it up to the opening. The interior was larger than it appeared from outside. The hollow extended upward into the tree's core, opening into a rough oval chamber perhaps 8 feet across and 10 feet high. The walls were fibrous and thick. The floor was covered in a deep layer of decomposed wood, soft, dry, pale as ash. Above, through a natural gap in the wood where an old branch had fallen away, she could see a narrow slice of gray sky. A chimney, rough and imperfect, but a chimney. Norah sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long moment. Then she stood, took the candle in one hand, and reached the other back toward her son. "Come and see," she said. Everett ducked through the opening and stood beside her. He looked up at the gap in the ceiling, then at the curved walls, then at the soft floor beneath their feet. His face did things that 9-year-old faces do when they are trying to decide how to feel, when the situation is too strange for any practiced response. Finally, he said, "It's bigger than it looks." "Most things are," Norah told him. She set the candle on a root that jutted from the floor and straightened up. "This is our home, Everett, for now. Maybe for longer than now. But we are going to make it work." She looked at him steadily. "Do you understand?" He looked around the hollow again. Then he nodded, once slowly, the way he did when he had decided something. "Yes, Mama." He moved to the curved wall and ran his fingers along the bark. Then he stopped. "Mama, there's writing here." Norah brought the candle close. Carved into the inner bark, faint with age, was a name, a woman's name, and a year so old the numerals had nearly been swallowed back into the wood. She did not recognize the name, but she felt the weight of it. Someone had been here before them, a woman, in a hard winter, before there was anything else to shelter in. She pressed her fingertips lightly against the carved letters and said nothing. The work began the next morning, before the sun had fully risen. Norah had spent the first night in the hollow with her coat on, and Everett pressed against her side, and she had not slept much, but she had thought a great deal. She had gone through her father's lessons the way another woman might go through a recipe box, methodically, in order, pulling out what she needed. First, the floor. The decomposed wood pulp was damp in the lower layers, drawing cold up from the ground. She spent the first morning scooping it out by the armload, hauling it through the opening, and piling it against the outside of the tree's base, where it would serve a different purpose later. When she hit solid root system beneath, dense and dry and interlocked like fingers, she began bringing flat stones from the creek bed 50 yards away. She carried them 2 at a time, Everett carrying one, stacking them in rows across the floor until the entire surface was covered. The stones held no warmth yet, but they would. That was the principle her father had pressed into her understanding so many years ago that it felt less like something she had learned and more like something she had always known. Stone and wood and earth were not enemies of warmth. They were its keepers. You simply had to teach them, slowly, patiently, over days, what you wanted them to hold. She cut pine boughs and laid them over the stones in a thick layer, soft, dry, insulating, a floor that would not steal the heat from sleeping bodies. Then the walls. There was clay in the creek bank, gray-blue and dense, packed in thick seams between the stones. She dug it out with her hands and carried it back to the hollow in the cast-iron pot her husband had used for everything. She packed it against the inner walls of the tree in smooth, even layers, pressing it into every crack and gap, sealing the fibrous wood behind a skin of clay that would absorb heat from the small stove and hold it through the night. Everett worked beside her without complaint. He was not a talkative child in the best of circumstances, and he seemed to understand, in the way of perceptive children, that this was not the time for questions. He carried clay. He hauled stones. When she showed him how to smooth the clay against the wall with the flat of his palm, pressing out the air pockets, he did it with a concentration that made something ache behind her ribs. The chimney was the most careful work. She found flat stones narrow enough to stack inside the existing gap in the wood above, building a rough flue that would carry smoke upward and out. She sealed around each stone with clay. It took the better part of a day, working with her arms raised until her shoulders burned. When she finally lowered the small cast-iron stove into position on its platform of flat river stones and lit a fire inside it, the smoke rose in a straight column, wavered once, and then found the flue and disappeared upward without hesitation. Norah pressed her hand against the clay wall. It was cold still, but it would not be cold forever. Your grandfather called it the slow pour, she told Everett, who was watching the stove with solemn attention. You put the heat in slowly, and the wall drinks it. And then the wall gives it back to you all through the night, long after the fire goes low. She looked at the curved interior around them, the stone floor, the clay walls, the thick wood beyond. We're not fighting the cold, Everett. We're filling the walls with warmth and letting the tree do the rest. Everett considered this. Like a cup, he said. She looked at him. You fill a cup, he said carefully, and it keeps the water, even after you stop pouring. Norah was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. Exactly like that. They had been there 4 days when the visitors came. Norah heard them before she saw them. Voices carrying through the cold air, the sound of a group of men who are not trying to be quiet because they do not feel they need to be. She stepped out of the hollow to find 4 of them standing at the edge of the clearing, their breath making clouds in the frozen air. Harlan Drum was at the front. He was Silas Drum's son, a young man of perhaps 30, with his father's broad build and none of his father's restraint. He had grown up in this settlement with the confidence of a person who has never been told no by anything he couldn't simply go around. He looked at the hollow, at the faint smoke rising from the gap high in the cottonwood's trunk, and then at Norah, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has come to be entertained. Well, he said, she's actually still here. The men behind him laughed. Harlan walked a slow circle around the base of the tree, hands in his pockets, looking it over with the leisurely attention of someone examining a curiosity at a county fair. Vance's Folly, he said, as if naming it. That's what they're calling it in town. He glanced at the others. 2 weeks, boys. I give her 2 weeks. He looked back at Norah. She met his eyes and said nothing. That seemed to bother him more than anything she might have said. He waited a moment, then shrugged, and the group moved on. Norah watched them go. Then she turned back to the hollow and continued laying clay. There is something that must be understood here. Something that explains why Norah Vance was not simply building a shelter. She was building something that worked on entirely different principles than anything the settlement around her knew. The cabins of that settlement were built to fight the cold. Norah's hollow was built to hold the warmth. One is a shield. The other is a vessel. And a vessel, once filled, does not empty overnight. Consider what Silas Drum had built with his own hands over a lifetime. His house was the finest structure in the settlement. Notched logs fitted with the precision of a master craftsman, a fireplace large enough to stand in, a chimney that drew powerfully even in still air. He had spent decades learning his craft, and his knowledge was genuine and deep and hard-won. But even his house, on a truly bitter night, was locked in a battle it could not fully win. The cold did not respect craftsmanship. It crept through the gaps in the chinking, however carefully sealed. It radiated back from the very logs that were supposed to stop it, because the logs themselves held cold, stored it in their fibers the way a stone stores cold in its deep layers, and then released it slowly back into the room. Touch the wall of Silas Drum's cabin on a hard winter night, and you would feel that patient, deep cold radiating outward, pressing inward, waiting. The fireplace had to rage to overcome it. Wood was consumed at a ruinous rate. The moment the fire dimmed, the stored cold in the walls reasserted itself. Norah's hollow worked differently. Not through opposition, but through accumulation. The walls of the cottonwood were not 10 inches thick. They were, in most places, closer to 3 feet. 3 feet of ancient, fibrous, porous wood, full of millions of tiny trapped air pockets that stopped heat from moving through them the way the logs of a cabin never could. That wood had been growing for longer than anyone in the settlement had been alive. Thickening year by year, decade by decade, building up its walls the way the earth builds up its layers. Slowly, with the patience of something that has no deadline. The wall of that hollow was not a barrier fighting the cold from outside. It was a great sleeping animal, dense, slow, and almost impossibly good at holding whatever temperature it had already reached. When Norah lit the small stove and pressed the heat gently into those clay-lined walls, she was not heating the air. She was heating the tree itself. Slowly, over hours and then days, the warmth crept outward into the wood, layer by layer, until the walls themselves became the source of heat, radiating it back inward through the night, long after the fire had burned down to coals. The clay she had pressed so carefully into every crack was not merely decoration. It was a conductor, drawing the warmth from the stove and spreading it evenly across the wooden surface, ensuring that no part of the wall stayed cold while another grew warm. The whole interior became, in time, a single radiating surface, a low, even, pervasive heat that had no cold corner to hide in. Her small stove used a fraction of the wood that Silas Drum's great fireplace demanded, and the warmth it produced did not vanish when the fire slept. It stayed, held by 3 feet of ancient cottonwood and a careful skin of river clay. Patient and waiting, the way her father had always said warmth would wait for you if you gave it somewhere to live. She was not fighting the winter. She had made herself a part of it, a warm, still part, tucked inside the oldest living thing in the canyon, learning from it the way the tree had learned from 100 winters before this one, by yielding to nothing, by holding what was given, by simply enduring until the season changed. 3 days into the second week, Norah learned what hunger with a child beside you feels like. She had known hunger before. There had been lean seasons in her life, stretches where the money ran short and the meals ran thin. And she had navigated them with the stoicism of a woman who has learned that feelings are least useful precisely when they are most intense. But those times, she had been hungry alone. This was different. She had enough for Everett. She would make certain of that. But making certain of it meant eating very little herself. A piece of dried meat in the morning. A few mouthfuls of the thin broth she kept simmering on the stove from bones she had gathered. She told Everett she had already eaten when she put his plate down. She said it easily, the way mothers have always said untrue things in order to keep the world intact for the people they love. Everett said nothing. On the third night, he put his own supper, a small portion of dried meat and a piece of hardtack, on the flat stone in front of her and said he wasn't hungry. Then he lay down with his back to the room and pretended to sleep. He was not sleeping. Norah could tell by the particular stillness of him, the held breath quality of a child pretending very hard. She looked at the food on the stone for a long time. She did not eat it, but she did not move it either. She sat beside it in the firelight, one hand resting near it, and she made herself a promise she intended to keep. The next morning, she took Everett out before dawn and showed him 3 things her father had taught her: how to read the ground for animal runs, how to notch a sapling into a simple snare, and how to wait without moving. They set 4 snares in the brush along the creek. Then they went back to work. Act 2. By midday, Everett was running back across the clearing, and his face was a thing Norah would carry with her for the rest of her life. "It worked!" he shouted. "Mama, it worked! Grandfather's trick worked!" He held up a rabbit, small and still, by the scruff of its neck. His whole body was vibrating with something that was not quite pride and not quite amazement, but the joy of a child who has discovered that the world will sometimes cooperate with you if you know how to ask. Norah crossed the clearing and took the rabbit from him and held it a moment before she pulled him close. Her face was pressed into his hair, and she kept it there for a count of 5, and when she lifted her head, her expression was the same as always, steady, composed, ready. But her eyes were wet. "Well done," she said. "Your grandfather would be proud of you." Everett pulled back and looked at her carefully. "Are you crying, Mama?" "No," Norah said. He looked at her for another moment. "Okay," he said, in the tone of a child who has decided to believe something because it is what is needed. It was around this time that Timber came into their lives. Everett found him on an afternoon walk along the creek, a black dog, lean and watchful, sitting alone at the edge of the brush with the particular stillness of an animal that has been waiting so long it has forgotten what it was waiting for. He was not aggressive. He simply looked at Everett with amber eyes and held very still, the way wild things hold still when they are trying to decide whether something is safe. Everett crouched down in the snow. He did not reach out. He did not make sounds. He simply crouched there at eye level and waited, which was, Norah would think later, exactly the right thing to do, and the kind of instinct that cannot be taught, only carried. The dog looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he took one step forward and sat down again. Everett came back to the hollow with the dog at his heels and the expression of a child who has already decided and is simply informing the relevant adult of the outcome. "He was alone," Everett said. "He doesn't belong to anyone." Norah looked at the dog. The dog looked at Norah with those amber eyes, calm, steady, assessing. He did not wag his tail. He did not perform eagerness. He simply looked at her with the quiet dignity of a creature who has been through something and arrived on the other side of it with his character intact. "We don't have enough food," she said. "He can help with the snares," Everett said. "He already showed me where the rabbit runs are. He knows more than I do." Norah looked at the dog for another moment. He had not moved. He sat in the entrance of the hollow and waited for her verdict with the patience of an animal who understood that patience was sometimes the only thing you had to offer. "1 week," she said. "We try it for 1 week." That night, Everett named him Timber for the particular color of his coat in firelight. Not black after all, but a deep, warm brown, the color of old heartwood. That first night, Timber positioned himself across the entrance to the hollow and slept there without moving until dawn. He did not need to be asked. He simply understood what was needed and did it. In the morning, Norah stepped carefully over him to go check the snares, and he lifted his head and watched her go, and then laid his chin back down on his paws and kept his post. She did not tell Everett she had already decided to keep him. She let the week run its course, but she knew from that first morning, watching the dog hold his place at the entrance with the seriousness of someone who has found his work at last, that the week was a formality. It was around this time that a woman began leaving provisions. They appeared before sunrise on the flat stone beside the entrance, a small cloth bundle containing dried beans, a piece of salt pork, 3 tallow candles. No note, no name. 3 days later, cornmeal and a folded piece of heavy wool. The week after, a small jar of preserved fruit, carefully sealed, and dried herbs tied with string. Norah did not know who left them. She suspected, from the careful knots and the quality of the preserving, that it was a woman of some experience, someone who understood what another woman might need and was providing it quietly, without spectacle, without credit, through the invisible way that women have always helped each other when the world is watching for other things. Whoever she was, Norah was grateful in a way she did not express aloud. Gratitude felt fragile right now, too close to need, and need felt too close to the thing Reverend Marsh had implied she was. So she accepted the bundles and continued working. It was Reverend Marsh who came on a cold afternoon and made the stakes explicit. Timber gave his low warning note before Norah heard the footsteps. She came to the entrance just as the Reverend came around the base of the tree. A lean man who wore his authority like a coat he had been born in and could not imagine removing. He looked at the hollow, at the small curl of smoke rising from the gap above, at Timber watching him with amber eyes, and his mouth pressed into a thin line. "Mrs. Vance," he said. "Reverend," she said, "I came to make certain you were surviving." "I am," she said. He looked at the clay she had worked into the bark around the opening. Something moved behind his eyes. Not admiration, not yet. Closer to unease. A woman in your position should consider whether pride is a luxury she can afford. "I'm not certain I understand you," Norah said, though she understood him perfectly. "There are those in town who would take the boy," he said, "if it were determined that his circumstances here were." He did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Norah felt the cold then. Not the cold of the air, but an interior cold, precise and sharp. The cold of understanding exactly what was at stake. "Everett is warm," she said. "He is fed. He is learning." She held the Reverend's gaze. "Is there something else you'd like to know?" Reverend Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back the way he had come. Timber watched him until he was out of sight. Then he walked back into the hollow and lay down beside Everett without fanfare. Everett looked up from the piece of slate he had been writing his letters on. "What did he want?" "Nothing important," Norah said. She went back to work on the clay. It was Aldous Webb who appeared at the end of the third week, arriving with the energy of someone who has been working up to something and has finally decided to do it. He was a younger man, lean and careful in his movements, with untidy hair and precise speech. The combination of someone whose mind moved faster than his circumstances. He was the settlement's only man with legal training and the willingness to apply it. He introduced himself at the edge of the clearing and did not pretend he had been passing by. "I've been looking at the land papers," he said. "The ones that gave the Drum family authority over this canyon." Norah watched him steadily. "And? There are questions." He paused. "I'd like to ask them on your behalf if you're willing, without fee." Norah looked at him for a long moment, the way she had learned to look at things that seemed too useful, checking for the catch. "Why?" she said. He considered the question with genuine seriousness. "Because the papers don't look right. And things that don't look right tend to bother me." Everett, who had appeared silently beside Norah at some point during this conversation, looked up at Aldous with his steady eyes. Then he looked at his mother. Then he looked back at Aldous and gave a single, brief nod. The nod of a child who has rendered a verdict. Norah saw it. She said nothing about it. "All right, Mr. Webb," she said. "Ask your questions." The afternoon Silas Drum himself came to the canyon was the afternoon everything became clearer. He came alone. He was a large man, not merely in size, but in the way he occupied space, as if the air rearranged itself to accommodate him. He had built most of what stood in that settlement with his own hands, and he wore that knowledge as a quiet, settled certainty. He stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the hollow for a long time. Then he looked at Norah. "What in God's name are you doing?" he said. It was not a cruel question. It was an honest one. The question of a man who has spent decades understanding how the physical world works and is looking at something that appears to contradict everything he knows. Living, she said. He walked slowly around the base of the tree, examining it. He looked at the clay work around the opening, the decomposed wood pulp packed against the outside walls in a thick berm, the hidden flue above. He crouched and looked at the stone floor through the entrance, at the small stove, glowing steadily on its platform. He stood up. "The damp will get into the wood," he said. "The cold will find the gaps. When the real winter comes—" He stopped. "This is not a house, Mrs. Vance. It is a rotten tree." Norah put her hand flat against the bark beside the entrance. "Feel," she said. He looked at her. "Not there," she said. "Inside." After a moment, and she could see what that moment cost him, that small giving way, Silas Drum crouched and reached through the entrance and placed his bare hand on the clay-covered wall inside the hollow. He was still for a long time. "It's warm," he said. Not with triumph. Not with understanding. Not yet. With the sound of a man who has just discovered that a load-bearing wall in his understanding of the world has cracked. "The wall drinks the heat," Norah said. "My father taught me. The wood holds it long after the fire goes low. You are not fighting the cold from outside. You are filling the inside until the cold has no room left." Silas withdrew his hand and stood up. He looked at the tree, truly looked at it, the way he had looked at timber all his life, reading it. She could see him recalculating. She could see the machinery of a skilled mind rearranging itself around new information, reluctantly, and then less reluctantly, with a speed that told her he was understanding more than she had said. He looked at her. "My father," he said, and then stopped. Something shifted in his expression. Something that had nothing to do with the hollow or the clay walls or the thermal mass she had spent 3 weeks building. Something personal and complicated and, she thought, guilty. But he didn't finish the sentence. "This is still drumland," he said instead. "Mr. Webb seems to think that's worth examining," Norah said. Silas's face went very still. "Good day, Mrs. Vance," he said. He walked back to the settlement. Norah watched him until the trees took him, her hand still resting against the bark of the cottonwood. Then she went inside, where Everett was sitting cross-legged on the pine bough floor, writing letters on his piece of slate, Timber's warm weight pressed against his side. "Mama," Everett said without looking up. "Are we poor?" Norah looked around the hollow, at the firelight moving on the clay walls, at the stone floor, warm now to the touch, at her son's bent head and the dog sleeping against him and the small, careful domesticity of it all, the hanging herbs, the stacked provisions, the folded wool against the wall. "No, sweetheart," she said, "we are rich in what matters." Everett nodded, accepting this, and went back to his letters. And somewhere in the settlement, a man who had just touched a warm wall in a hollow tree was sitting in his fine house, looking at his hands and thinking about something his father had written down a very long time ago. Something he had hoped would stay buried. But the ground, as Norah's father had always said, keeps nothing forever. Martha Hale did not knock. She simply appeared at the edge of the clearing on a cold afternoon, her hands at her sides, her head slightly down. The posture of a person who has rehearsed something many times and has arrived anyway, no longer certain any of the rehearsed versions will serve. Everett saw her first. He had been outside checking the snares along the creek, Timber at his heels, and he came back across the clearing with the alert stillness of a child who has noticed something and is waiting to understand it. He stopped beside Norah and said, very quietly, "Mama, Mrs. Hale is outside. She's crying." Norah looked up from the clay she was working into a crack in the outer wall. Martha Hale was perhaps 60 years old, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now something better, worn into honesty by years of weather and feeling. She was a widow herself, had been for a long time, and Norah had known her only slightly before all of this, a woman who kept to herself, quietly competent in the way of people who have had to be, who always seemed to carry a weight she had decided not to mention. She was crying now, not loudly, just the tears coming down her face in the cold, which was perhaps worse. Norah looked at her for a moment. She thought about the cloth bundles, the dried beans, and the salt pork, and the folded wool, the preserved fruit sealed carefully in its jar. She had suspected in a general way, without allowing herself to suspect specifically, because specificity would have meant asking a question whose answer she was not yet ready to know. She stepped back from the entrance. "Come in, Martha," she said. "It's cold." Martha Hale sat on the pine bough floor with her hands in her lap and told the whole of it without stopping, the way people tell things they have been holding too long, in a single breath, almost, as if stopping would mean never starting again. Silas Drum had come to her 6 weeks ago, not long after Norah had been put out of the company house. He had sat at her table and laid out the arithmetic of it with the directness of a man who has decided not to waste anyone's time with softness. Her husband's debt to the company, the amount which was considerable, the fact that it had passed to her at his death, the fact that she could not pay it, and then the offer, if Martha would persuade Norah Vance to leave the canyon, through friendship, through counsel, through the particular influence that one woman in difficult circumstances might have over another, the debt would be cleared, all of it, without another word. Martha had said yes. She had told herself it was the only reasonable thing. She had told herself she was protecting her husband's name, ensuring she could keep the house, that Norah would be better off in town anyway, that it was a kindness in its way. She had crafted the whole structure of it very carefully, the way a person builds a shelter against a truth they cannot bear to stand in, reason by reason, until the thing was thick enough to live inside. And then she had left the bundles of food. She said this last part very quietly, looking at her hands. "I told myself I was helping you," she said. "I don't know if that's true anymore." The hollow was very quiet. The fire in the small stove made its small sounds. Timber, who had come inside and stationed himself between Martha and the back wall, watched her with amber eyes. Norah was silent for a long time. She looked at Martha, at the hands in the lap, at the wet face, at the 60 years of a life that had required a great deal of bending and had left marks. She thought about what it meant to be a woman in circumstances that did not leave much room for choosing cleanly. She thought about the debt, about the house, about the particular trap that had been set, and the particular person who had set it. "Who else knows?" she said finally. "No one," Martha said. "Only Silas." Norah nodded slowly. "Then we will decide together what to do with it," she said. Martha looked up. Her expression was the expression of a person who has walked into a room expecting one thing and found something else entirely. Not punishment, not absolution, but something more complicated and more real than either. "You're not angry," she said. "I'm angry," Norah said, "but not at you." She looked at the fire. Silas Drum put you in an impossible position and waited to see what you would do. That is not your fault. That is his." She paused. "The food helped," she said. "Every bundle of it." Martha made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. Timber got up, walked across the hollow, and lay down with his chin on Martha's foot. It was Aldous who brought the paper 3 days later. He came at mid-morning, moving quickly in the way he had when something had shifted in his thinking. That forward lean, that slightly untidy energy of a mind that has been working through the night and arrived somewhere it didn't expect. He sat down on the flat stone outside the hollow entrance and unfolded a document on his knee. "The original deed of survey for this canyon," he said. "Or rather, the deed that was meant to be filed and wasn't." He looked at her. "And something else. Something that was in a different place than it should have been." He held out a piece of paper. Norah took it. She unfolded it carefully, though her hands had already recognized the texture of it. Old paper, soft at the creases, pressed flat a long time ago. The same paper. The same handwriting she had found in her husband's tool case. The hand she had not recognized then and thought about every day since. She read it, all of it, this time, because Aldous had found the complete document, not just the fragment she had carried in her coat pocket. It was a letter, written in the careful, deliberate hand of a man who had learned to write late in life, and still formed every letter as if it mattered. It explained in plain and methodical language the following: that the writer, Silas Drum's father, a man who had worked the mining camps of this region for 30 years before his son brought him to the settlement to live out his last years, had been pulled from a collapsed tunnel some years prior by a young miner named Robert Vance. That Robert Vance had refused any payment. That the elder Drum had spent the remainder of his life trying to find a way to repay a debt the young man would not acknowledge. That he had found one way, finally. That he had surveyed and set aside the canyon land, the Cottonwood Canyon specifically, with its creek and its particular shelter from the prevailing winds, as a parcel apart from the company holdings. That this parcel was to pass to Robert Vance, and, upon his death, to his family. That the cottonwood tree, specifically, had been there when he first surveyed the canyon and had struck him as the kind of thing that ought to be protected. The letter was dated and witnessed. It was, in every legal sense that Aldous had been able to determine, a binding record of intent and transfer, and Silas Drum had known about it. Norah read the letter twice. Then she folded it slowly and carefully and held it in both hands. "He knew," she said. It was not a question. "He knew," Aldous said. "The canyon isn't company land. It never was. It was always—" "My husband's," Norah said, "and then ours." She thought about the foreman's notice, the men carrying her belongings into the snow, the Reverend watching from a distance, Silas Drum standing in the settlement street and telling her the land felt no grief for her. He had known the whole time that she was being removed from land that was legally hers. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up at the carved name on the bark above the entrance. The woman's name that Everett had found, with its old and half-swallowed year. "The name carved in the bark," she said. "Do you know whose it is?" Aldous was careful. "I looked into it," he said. "The name, it's your mother-in-law's, Robert Vance's mother. She came to this region before the settlement existed." He looked at the tree. "It appears she sheltered here, in a hard winter, before there was anything else to shelter in." Norah looked at the cottonwood. The tree had been here before the settlement, before Silas Drum's cabins and the Reverend's church, and the company's careful management of everything it could lay claim to. It had been here when the woman who became her husband's mother had pressed her name into its bark and survived a winter inside it, and now it was holding her too. The oldest things know how to survive the longest. "All right," Norah said. She stood. "What do we do next?" Timber knew 3 days before anyone else. He woke before dawn and began to pace. Not the restless pacing of a dog that wants to go outside, but something more purposeful, more urgent, a circuit from the entrance to the back wall and back again, his nails clicking against the stone floor, his head low, his tail still. Everett woke and watched him. "Timber's scared of something that isn't here yet," he said. Norah had been awake already, lying still in the dark, feeling the warmth radiating from the clay walls around her. She sat up and looked at the dog. She thought of her father. He'd kept a dog for most of his life and consulted him the way some men consulted barometers. He had told her once that dogs felt pressure changes in ways that human bodies did not register consciously, that they understood the architecture of weather before it arrived. She got up and went outside. The sky was wrong, not dramatically wrong, not the roiling purple-black of an obvious incoming storm. It was wrong in a subtler way. The light was the color of old bruises, a sallow yellow-gray that seemed to come from no particular direction. The air was very still, too still, and the cold had a quality she had only felt once before, as a child, when her father had taken her hand abruptly and said, without explanation, "Walk faster." She stood outside the hollow and looked at the sky for a long time. Then she went back inside and told Everett to stay with Timber, and she walked to the settlement. She went to every house. She knocked on every door that would open to her, which was not all of them. She stood on the step of Silas Drum's fine house and told his housekeeper that the animals were disturbed and the air pressure had changed in a way she recognized, and she believed a serious storm was coming. Possibly within a day, possibly sooner. She went to the general store. Grover looked at her with the politely skeptical expression that had become the settlement's default response to anything she said. The sky looked perfectly ordinary to him. She went to the Reverend's house. Reverend Marsh listened to her in the doorway with his hands folded and said he was certain the Lord would provide for those who lived rightly, and that perhaps she would benefit from less time alarming her neighbors and more time in reflection. She went to the settlement's only doctor, an older man with a reasonably open mind. He looked at her seriously when she described Timber's pacing and the color of the sky and the stillness. "Animals don't predict weather," he said, but he said it less certainly than the others. He looked at the sky himself, out his window. "I'll check my glass," he said, but I wouldn't. "Please check it soon," Norah said. She walked back through the settlement toward the canyon. Behind her, she heard Harlan Drum's voice from near the livery. "The mole woman is scared of sunshine," he called out. The group laughed. Norah did not turn around. She walked back to the hollow and told Everett they were going to spend the rest of the day making certain everything was ready. Extra wood, stacked inside. Extra water, the clay jars filled and sealed. The woven willow door checked and reinforced. Everett helped without asking why. Timber stopped pacing and lay down by the entrance with his chin on his paws. He didn't move from that position for the rest of the afternoon. The storm did not announce itself. One moment the world was the ordinary gray of a cold afternoon, and then something changed in the quality of the air. A pressure shift so sudden and complete that Norah felt it in her ears, a subtle compression, as if the sky had moved closer. Timber raised his head. Then the wind arrived. It did not build. It simply was. One moment absent, the next moment everywhere. A full-force presence that struck the cottonwood's broad trunk and broke around it the way a river breaks around a standing stone. The sound was not what she had expected. She had heard wind before, had heard storms before, had lived through winters that made the settlement's walls creak and the fire in the grate gutter and flare. This was different in its quality. This was not wind as she understood wind. This was a sustained, undifferentiated roar that had no individual gusts within it, no pauses, no variation, just the full force of something enormous pressing against the world without relenting. Inside the hollow, the sound changed immediately. The sharp, cold whistle of the outside world dropped to a deep, resonant hum, the voice of the tree absorbing the wind's force and redistributing it through 3 feet of ancient wood. She could feel it through the floor, through the walls. Not vibration exactly, more like a very deep, very slow pulse, as if the tree itself were breathing. Norah fed the stove, not dramatically, not the desperate heaping of fuel she knew was happening in every fireplace in the settlement at this moment, but steadily, methodically, enough to keep the heat building in the walls, enough to hold the temperature through whatever was coming. She thought about the barometer in the doctor's office. She thought about whether he had checked it, whether the needle had dropped far enough to alarm him, whether he had sent anyone to warn the outlying residents. She pushed the thought aside. There was nothing she could do about it now. The only thing she could do now was what she had been doing for weeks. Tend the fire, manage the heat, hold what she had built. It sounds so angry, Everett said. He was sitting on the pine bough floor with Timber pressed against his side, both of them watching the small stove. Let it be angry, Norah said. We are not outside. She put her hand on the wall. The clay was warm beneath her palm, not merely not cold, genuinely, radiantly warm, the warmth of something that had been patiently absorbing heat for weeks and had finally reached the point where it could give as much as it received. The great tree around them had become, exactly as her father had promised, a vessel holding warmth against the world. Outside, the storm tore at everything that could be torn. Inside, the air was still. The first knock came 2 hours after the storm began. Timber raised his head before Norah heard it. She crossed to the entrance and pulled back the woven door. The cold hit her immediately, a wall of it, stealing the breath. In the darkness beyond the entrance, the storm had brought an early dark. She could see shapes. A woman, 2 children, one of them very small, pressed against the woman's side. A man behind them with his arm around all 3, his face raw and stripped by the cold. She recognized them, Harlan Drum's sister and her family. Their house was on the exposed northern edge of the settlement, the side that took the full force of the prevailing wind. The woman said nothing. She was past words. She held her youngest child out toward Norah in both arms, the way you hold something precious when you understand that your own ability to protect it is finished. The child's lips were the color of the winter sky. Norah stepped back from the entrance. Come in, she said, all of you. Come in now. They came in, the children first, guided by Norah's hands toward the warmth of the stove. She wrapped the smallest one in the folded wool from her shelf and held the child against her own body, pressing warmth into the small, rigid form. Everett, without being asked, moved to the other child. a boy of perhaps 7, and sat beside him and began talking in a low, steady voice about timber, about the snares, about the rabbit, about anything that was warm and ordinary and safe. The man, Harlan's brother-in-law, stood in the entrance with his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with something that was not cold. "Thank you," he said. It came out rough, the sound of a word that had too much inside it. "Sit down," Norah told him. "Get warm." What would you have done if the door had been yours to open or to close? They came one by one after that across the next 3 hours. Grover arrived with the expression of a man who has burned through every piece of furniture he owns and still cannot hold a temperature. He ducked through the entrance and stood in the warmth and closed his eyes. 2 families from the eastern row of cabins arrived together, the adults carrying children between them, moving with the deliberation of people conserving the last of their body heat. Reverend Marsh came alone. He stood in the entrance for a moment longer than the others had, looking at the interior of the hollow, at the clay walls, at the stone floor, at the stove burning quietly in the center, at the people already arranged in the space in the careful organization Norah had established. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man reckoning, privately and visibly, with the distance between what he had said and what he was standing inside. He said nothing. He sat down against the far wall and pulled his coat around himself and was, for the first time in Norah's experience of him, entirely quiet. And then, at last, Silas Drum. He came alone. Of course he came alone. He was not a man who arrived in groups, who hid behind the motion of others. He came around the base of the cottonwood with his head up, the way he always moved, and he stopped at the entrance and looked at Norah. She looked back at him. She thought of her husband's tool case, of the letter inside it, of the man who had known, who had watched the land papers being drawn up and the notice being nailed to the door and the belongings being carried into the snow, and had said, with the calm authority of a man who believed himself to be on solid ground, that the land felt no grief for her. She thought about the elder Drum, who had written carefully on a piece of paper, "It was always meant to be yours." She thought about the canyon, about the carved name above the entrance, about the woman who had pressed her name into the bark of this tree in a hard winter, before there was anything else. Silas said nothing. He was not a man who would beg. She had understood that about him from the beginning. But he was standing at the entrance to her home in the middle of a storm that had stripped every pretension from the night, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has arrived at the limit of everything he thought he knew. Norah looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." He ducked through the entrance. He straightened up inside the hollow and looked around, at the walls, warm to the touch, at the people gathered in the small, steady light, at the dog watching him without aggression, at the boy sitting with another child, teaching him something in a low, patient voice. He found a space against the wall and sat down. He did not speak. Norah went back to the stove. She added a log. 1 log, no more than needed, exactly enough. And the warmth in the walls deepened by some fraction she could feel but not measure. Outside, the storm pressed against the 3 feet of ancient cottonwood and found, as it had been finding for hours, that the tree had no interest in giving way. The oldest things know how to survive the longest. 18 people breathed the still warm air and listened to the world coming apart outside, and did not come apart themselves. The first night was the hardest, not because of the cold, The walls held exactly as they were built to hold, the clay radiating its patient warmth into every corner of the hollow in slow, even waves. Not because of the storm, which pressed against the outside of the cottonwood with a force that would have dismantled ordinary structures and found, repeatedly and without progress, that the tree had no interest in yielding. The first night was the hardest because of the people, 18 of them in a space built for one. The logistics of it were considerable. Norah had thought during those long weeks of preparation about warmth and food and water and light. She had not thought, there had been no reason to think, about the difficulty of placing enemies in close proximity and asking them to breathe the same air. Reverend Marsh sat against the far wall with his knees drawn up and his hands folded and his eyes on the middle distance, which was, in this space, approximately 4 feet away from Grover's left shoulder. Grover sat with his back very straight and his jaw set in the manner of a man who is determined not to acknowledge that he is sitting on a pine bough floor inside a tree. Harlan Drum's sister, her name was Clara, Norah had learned, had arranged herself and her children in the warmest corner near the stove with the focused efficiency of a mother who has stopped caring about anything except her children's immediate comfort. Harlan himself had arrived near midnight. Norah had not expected him. She had assumed, with some justice, that Harlan Drum was the kind of young man who would freeze to death before he would ask a favor from someone he had publicly mocked. But apparently, the cold had its own opinions about what a person would and would not do, because he came through the entrance with his hat in his hand and his face raw, and his expression stripped of everything that had previously occupied it. He looked at Clara first, at his nephew, the small one, the one whose lips had been the color of the winter sky. The child was asleep now, warm, color restored, tucked between Clara and Timber's broadside. Something moved through Harlan's face when he saw the child sleeping. He found a space near the entrance and sat down without a word. Norah gave him a portion of the dried meat and said nothing else. She organized them the way her father had organized the work of the forest, not by giving orders, but by creating a structure so obvious and sensible that people stepped into it naturally, the way water finds its level. The space near the stove was for the children and the coldest among them. She assessed each person as they came in, looking for the signs her father had taught her. The grayness around the mouth that meant the body was pulling blood inward. The clumsiness of hands that had been too cold too long. The dangerous drowsiness that was not tiredness, but something more serious. 3 of the adults showed signs that concerned her. She put them near the stove and kept watch. The food she had, more than she had expected between her own stores and the bundles Martha had left, she divided carefully. Not equally, because equal was not the same as right. The children first, the coldest adults next, the rest in proportion. No one complained. They were past the point where complaint seemed worth the energy. Water she heated in the cast iron pot in relays, refilling it from the clay jars she had prepared, keeping a constant supply of warm water moving through the space. She had learned from her father that warmth taken internally worked faster than warmth applied from outside, and she pressed cups of hot water into hands that could barely hold them and watched, with quiet satisfaction, the slow return of color to faces that had been too pale. There was something she had not anticipated in all those weeks of building and planning, the silence between people who have wronged each other and now must share bread. Grover sat 4 feet from Reverend Marsh and neither of them spoke, but at some point in the second hour, when the Reverend's hands were shaking despite the warmth, it was Grover who refilled his cup without being asked. He set it down without comment. The Reverend nodded without looking up. That was all. It was enough. Harlan's brother-in-law, a quiet man named Foster who had never, in Norah's observation, done anything to deserve what this winter had brought him, sat near the entrance and kept himself apart, the way of a man who is ashamed by association and doesn't know how to separate himself from it. Norah brought him food without ceremony and crouched beside him for a moment. "Your family is warm," she said. He looked at his hands. "They are," he said, "because of you." "Because your children needed warmth," she said, "and it was here." She stood and moved on, because there was always something else that needed doing, and because some things did not require elaboration. Everett helped. This was the thing she would remember. Not the logistics, not the organization, not even the warmth of the walls, but the sight of her 9-year-old son moving through the cramped space of the hollow with a cup of warm water and a piece of dried meat, crouching beside each person in turn, asking in his low, careful voice if they needed anything, refilling cups, adjusting the wool blankets she had distributed. He did not look to her for instruction. He simply saw what needed doing and did it. She watched him and felt something she had no adequate name for. Pride was too small. Gratitude was too large. It was somewhere in between. The feeling of a parent who realizes, unexpectedly, that she has already succeeded at the most important part. Harlan's nephew was the one who couldn't speak. Norah noticed it early in the first night. The child, whose name she later learned was Thomas, sat pressed against his mother's side with his eyes very wide and his mouth entirely still. Not the stillness of a child who is simply quiet. The particular frozen quality of a child who has seen something that has temporarily taken language away, Clara explained in a low voice when Norah crouched beside her. The roof of their cabin had come down. Not the whole roof, just one section, the section above the main room where they had all been sitting. Thomas had been sitting directly beneath it. He was not hurt, not physically, but he had not spoken since. Timber had positioned himself, without direction, against Thomas's other side. He pressed his warm weight against the child's side and laid his chin on Thomas's knee and breathed slowly and steadily, a rhythm as deliberate as a heartbeat. Thomas looked at him. Everett had settled on Thomas's other side, cross-legged on the floor. He didn't say anything for a while, just sat. Then he began talking, quietly, almost to himself, about the snare he had set along the creek and the rabbit he had caught. He described Timber's first morning with them, the way the dog had stationed himself across the entrance and regarded the world outside with enormous seriousness. He described the clay work on the walls and how his mother had shown him the right pressure to use with the flat of the palm, and how the wall had felt cold for days and then one morning had been warm when he touched it. He talked about warmth the way adults talk about things that matter but are difficult to explain, circling around the center of it, approaching from different angles, letting the subject speak for itself. Thomas's hands, which had been pressed flat against his own knees, relaxed by degrees. After perhaps an hour, Everett talking, Thomas listening, Timber breathing between them, the child reached out and put one hand on Timber's back. Timber's tail moved once. A few minutes after that, in a voice so small it was nearly inaudible, Thomas said, "Can I keep petting the dog?" No one made a point of it. Clara pressed her lips together and looked at the wall. Her husband turned his face away. Grover, who was sitting close enough to have heard, developed a sudden and absorbing interest in the lacing of his boot. Everett said, "Yes, he likes it behind the ears best." Thomas petted the dog behind the ears. Timber sighed with the deep contentment of an animal who has understood his purpose and is fulfilling it completely. Harlan, from across the hollow, watched his nephew's face change. He looked away quickly, but not before Norah saw it. The second day of the storm was the quietest. The wind had not lessened. If anything, it had deepened, settling into a sustained roar that the cottonwood's walls translated into a low, almost musical vibration. But the people inside had moved past the acute phase of their fear and arrived at something more sustainable. The long patience of people who have accepted that they are where they are and must simply endure until they are somewhere else. Norah rationed and managed and watched and adjusted. She added wood to the stove in careful increments, never letting the fire rage, never letting it die, keeping the heat input exactly matched to what the walls needed to maintain their slow, deep warmth. She checked the flue twice, climbing the makeshift internal structure she had built to reach it, clearing the ice that had formed at the upper opening. Martha helped. The older woman had found her footing in that quiet way she had, not announcing herself, not taking up space, but making herself useful in the way of someone who has spent decades understanding what usefulness looks like. She managed the food distribution with a fairness and tact that Norah could not have improved upon. She sat with the mothers of the younger children and talked with them in a low voice about ordinary things, about recipes, about the spring garden, about the proper way to preserve apple butter, creating a thread of normalcy in an abnormal situation. She caught Norah's eye once, across the crowded space, and something passed between them that did not require words. The thing that had happened between them, the debt, the offer, the choice, the confession, had not been forgotten, but it had been set aside, placed carefully in the mental space that practical women reserve for things that need to be dealt with later, after the immediate emergency has been managed. Later would come. They both knew it. For now, there was work to do. The second night brought Silas Drum to speech. It happened after the others had found their way into sleep. Not the deep, easy sleep of comfort, but the provisional sleep of exhaustion. Clara and her children were curled together near the stove. Grover had his back against the warm clay wall and his chin on his chest. Reverend Marsh, to Norah's mild surprise, slept with the straightforward totality of a man who has made his peace with the night. Harlan slept near the entrance, as if maintaining a technical proximity to the outside that allowed him to continue not fully admitting he was inside. Silas did not sleep. He sat against the far wall with his large hands resting on his knees, looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man engaged in an internal conversation that was not going well for him. Norah sat near the stove, adding a log in the small hours, monitoring the heat with the methodical attention of someone for whom this was simply the work of the night. She was not surprised when he spoke. She had been, in some part of herself, waiting. "My father surveyed this canyon," he said. His voice was quiet. Not a confession, not yet. More like a man reading aloud from something, testing the sound of it. Norah said nothing. She added the log and settled the stove door and sat back. "He talked about it," Silas said. "Before he died. He talked about the cottonwood. He said it was the oldest living thing he'd ever stood next to, and that he'd stood next to some old things in his time." He paused. He said it reminded him that most of what men build is temporary, that the things that last are the things that know how to grow around their own damage. "The fire made its small sounds. He told me about your husband," Silas said. About what Robert Vance did in the tunnel. He was quiet for a moment. He said it was the only time in 40 years of mine work that he'd seen someone go back. Norah looked at the stove. She had known her husband was a good man. She had known it in the daily, intimate, unremarkable way of a marriage, in the way he'd folded the blankets in the morning and kept his word about small things and laughed at her father's jokes, even when he'd heard them before. She had not known this particular thing. The tunnel. The going back. It was, she thought, exactly what he would have done. The letter, Silas said. The deed. I found it in his papers after he died. I read it. He looked at his hands. I told myself there were reasons. That the land was part of the operation. That my father hadn't understood the legal complexities. That he'd meant well, but it wasn't practical. He paused. I told myself I was protecting what he built. Norah let the silence sit. Your father built it, she said finally, by giving my husband that land. You tore down what he built. Silas did not answer. The fire breathed. Outside, the storm pressed its case against the tree and found, as it kept finding, no purchase. The debt to Martha Hale, Norah said. Was it real? Yes, Silas said. That part was real. And the rest of it? A long pause. The rest of it, he said, was a reason that sounded like a reason. Norah looked at him across the fire-lit space. She thought about what she wanted to say. She thought about her husband in a collapsed tunnel, going back. She thought about what kind of man might be capable of sitting in the dark in the house of the person he had wronged and saying, at least, the true thing. All right, she said. She did not forgive him. She did not say she forgave him. Forgiveness was not what this moment required, and she was not a woman who said things she did not mean in order to make a situation tidier. But she acknowledged what he had said. She let it exist between them without covering it over. That was enough for now. Silas nodded once, slowly, and went back to looking at nothing. Aldous brought her a cup of warm water sometime in the deep hours of the second night. He simply appeared beside her with the cup. He had been managing the water heating for several hours, a task he had taken on without announcement, and held it out. She took it. He sat down beside her near the stove. Not so close as to be intrusive, but close in the way that people move close to each other when the world has contracted around them, and proximity is one of the few available comforts. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the storm and the sleeping people and the fire. After a time, he said quietly, "You built something remarkable." Norah looked at the walls, at the clay she had pressed in with her own palms, layer by layer, at the stone floor, at the chimney she had constructed from flat stones and patience, at the woven door holding back the weight of the outside world. My father built it, she said. I just remembered what he taught me. That's not a small thing, Aldous said. Remembering. She looked at him. He was looking at the stove, his face quiet in the firelight, and she thought, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, that he was a person of considerable substance underneath the untidy surface. A person who showed up and did the work without being asked and said true things, without making them into speeches. Her father would have liked him. Everett, she had noted, already did. She thought about what it might mean. Not now, not in this moment, but in the general future that was beginning to reassemble itself in her mind as a real possibility rather than a theoretical one. The land was hers. The hollow was hers. The knowledge was hers. What was built from here was hers to decide. Thank you for the water, she said. There's more, he said, whenever you need it. She turned back to the stove, and he stayed where he was, and neither of them said anything else, and that was, in its way, a kind of conversation. The fever broke in the gray hour before the third morning's dawn. Everett had been running warm since the second night. Not alarming, not the dangerous heat of a sick child, but a sustained warmth that was above what it should have been, that had made Norah check him with the flat of her wrist every few hours through the long nights. She had sat with him through the worst of it with her hand on his back, feeling the heat beneath her palm. She had kept him warm. She had kept him drinking. She had kept the fever from climbing. And in the gray hour before the third dawn, she put her hand on his back, and the heat was ordinary. She put her wrist to his forehead, and it was cool. She sat back on her heels and closed her eyes. One breath, two. Then she opened her eyes and went back to checking the stove. Martha was awake. She seemed to sleep in short intervals, and then come back without transition. The way of people whose sleep had been light for so many years, it had become a different thing entirely. She looked at Norah's face across the space, and her own face changed. "Better?" she said. "Better," Norah said. Martha made no elaborate response. She simply nodded, with the gravity of a woman who understood exactly what that single word contained. "You are stronger than you know, Norah Vance." Thomas, who had been sleeping against Timber's side, stirred when Everett's eyes opened, as if some communication had passed between them. He looked at Everett. Everett looked at him. "Still here," Everett said in the tone of someone reporting a fact. Thomas considered this. "Still here," he agreed. It was the most Thomas had said since the roof came down. Clara, on his other side, heard it and pressed her face against her husband's shoulder. Her husband wrapped an arm around her and looked at the ceiling of the hollow, at the curved ancient wood above, warm and massive and utterly unmoved by everything that had been happening outside it. His expression was the expression of a man reassessing something fundamental. The storm ended the way storms end in the heart of winter, not with drama, not with a clear declaration, but with a gradual lessening that you didn't quite trust until the silence had held for long enough to be real. The wind diminished by degrees across the third morning. The vibration in the walls faded. The sustained roar that had become simply the texture of the world began to differentiate itself. Gusts rather than a constant, intervals rather than a solid presence. By midday, it was quiet. Not the eerie, false quiet of the storm's approach, but the true quiet of aftermath. The particular hush of a landscape that has been remade and is still in the first moments of its new configuration. Norah opened the woven door. The cold that came through was sharp and clean, the cold of a world scoured back to its essentials. The canyon had been transformed, snow-piled in shapes that bore no relationship to the landscape she had learned over weeks of walking it. Every hollow filled, every rock buried, the creek invisible beneath a white architecture built overnight by wind and weather. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Behind her, she heard people beginning to stir, the sounds of a group coming back to itself after a long suspension. Grover coughing, Clara murmuring to the children, the sound of Harlan Drum getting to his feet. That combination of physical size and reluctance that was somehow distinctive. She heard Everett come to stand beside her. He looked out at the transformed canyon, at the white shapes where familiar things used to be, at the narrow slot of pale winter sky above the canyon walls, beginning to show, for the first time in days, something that might eventually become blue. Behind them, the hollow was slowly coming to life again. The sounds of people waking, of children being gathered, of the particular collective exhale of a group that has survived something and is only now beginning to understand that they have. Norah stood in the cold morning air and breathed it in. It was the same cold it had always been. The same sky, the same canyon walls, the same creek somewhere under all that white, the same cottonwood behind her. Unchanged by anything that had happened, as indifferent and as necessary as ever. She thought about her father. She thought about standing beside him in a forest and learning to be still, learning to look at what was actually there rather than what you expected to see. She thought about everything he had given her, not just the knowledge of trees and warmth and clay, but the habit of attention, the practice of looking until you understood. She had thought, in the worst of the crisis, that she was alone. She had felt alone in the days after the notice on the door, in the long nights when the hollow was cold, and the stove was not yet sufficient. And Everett pressed against her side, breathing the slow, even breath of a child, trusting his mother to keep him safe. She was not alone. She had never been alone. She had been carrying her father with her, his voice, his hands, his 40 years of looking at trees until he understood them. She had been carrying her husband, his careful hands on a tool case, his name scratched into the wood, his refusal to leave a man in a collapsed tunnel. She had been carrying the woman whose name was carved into the bark above the entrance. A woman she had never met, but who had stood in this same canyon in a winter that must have seemed to her as endless and as cold. She was the newest link in a chain that was longer than she could see in either direction. "We're still here," Everett said. "We're still here," she agreed. She put her hand on the bark of the cottonwood beside the entrance. It was warm beneath her palm. Not the warmth of the sun, which had not been seen for days, but the warmth of the tree itself. The warmth they had poured into it, slowly and patiently, over weeks of careful tending. The warmth it had kept for them through everything. She stepped out into the snow. The settlement looked smaller after the storm. That was the first thing Norah noticed when she walked through it on that first clear morning. Not the damage, which was considerable, but the scale of the place. It had always carried itself with a certain authority, the authority of permanence, of structures built to last. Now the authority was gone. The roof lines were wrong. The streets were buried. The things that had seemed solid and settled and beyond question were revealed in the storm's aftermath to have been solid only in relation to ordinary circumstances. Extraordinary ones had a different opinion. Several roofs had partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. The church had lost a section of its eastern wall. 3 of the smaller cabins on the settlement's exposed northern edge had sustained damage severe enough that their inhabitants could not return to them without significant repair. Grover stood in the doorway of his store when Norah passed, looking at the interior with the expression of a man calculating losses. He looked up when she stopped. He started to say something, stopped, started again. "The warmth," he finally said. "In the walls. When I put my hand on the wall this morning." He shook his head. "I've been building and running this store for 20 years, and I have never felt anything like that." "My father called it the slow pour," Norah said. "The wall drinks the heat over time. Once it's warm, it holds." Grover looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. Not the polite nod of a man who is done with a conversation, but the genuine nod of someone filing away information. "I'd like to learn more," he said, "if you're willing to explain it." "I'm willing," she said. She walked on. The news about the two men from the ridge came on the second morning after the storm. A group had gone out to check on the settlement's outlying residents, the trappers and solitary men who lived in the hills at varying distances, the people who existed at the edges of community without quite belonging to it. Two of them, older men who had lived alone on the far ridge for years, had not survived. Their cabins had held. That was the cruelty of it. The structures themselves were intact. But the cold had been more profound and more sustained than ordinary winter, and the wood supply of one had run out on the second night, and the other's chimney had blocked with ice early in the storm, and there had been no one to notice and no one to help. Norah heard this standing outside the hollow, and she stood very still for a moment. She thought about the morning she had gone through the settlement, knocking on doors, about Harlan's voice carrying across the cold air, about what it would have cost those two men to come down from the ridge, the distance, the effort, the pride of it, or the fear of it, or whatever it was that had kept them where they were. She thought about the two empty spaces they had left behind, the specific shapes of two lives that did not have to end when they did. Martha appeared beside her. She had developed in the days of the storm a quality that Norah had come to rely on without naming, a presence that was genuinely useful, that added rather than subtracted, that understood when words were needed and when they were not. "You tried to warn them," Martha said. "I know," Norah said. "It doesn't make it easier." They stood together in the cold for a while. Silas Drum came to the settlement meeting 2 days after the storm. It was not a formal meeting. It was simply the gathering that happened naturally when a community has been through something large and needs to look at each other and determine what comes next. People congregated at Grover's store, the largest interior space available, and stood among the shelves and spoke in the way of people who have recently been frightened and are moving carefully back toward ordinary life. Norah came because Aldous had told her she should, and because she had decided, somewhere in the long hours of the storm's second night, that she was done with the modesty of absenting herself from things that concerned her. Silas spoke early. He was not a man who built to a point through circumlocution. He stood in the center of the room with his hat in his hand. She had never seen him with his hat in his hand before. He was always covered, always fully assembled. And he said what he had to say in the plainest language available. He told them about the deed, about the canyon, about his father's letter and what it contained and what he had done with it, which was to set it aside and construct, around its existence, a version of events that served his purposes. He told it without adornment, and he did not minimize the specifics, which was more than many men would have managed. He said the canyon land belonged to Norah Vance, that it had always belonged to the Vance family, that the land papers the company had drawn up were drawn up on false premises, and that he had known this when they were drawn up, and that he had not said so. He said, "I was protecting what I thought my father had built. I was wrong about what he had built." The room was very quiet. Then one of the older men, a builder who had worked alongside Silas for years, said without rancor, "Well, that's a thing." And somehow that was enough. Not absolution, not erasure, but acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that a community offers when one of its members has said a true thing at cost to themselves, which is to simply receive it and move forward. Norah stood at the edge of the room and watched. Harlan did not speak. He stood near the back with his arms crossed, looking at the floor, in the posture of a man engaged in private reckoning. When the meeting was over, he did not leave immediately. He waited until most of the others had gone, and then he crossed the room and stopped in front of Everett. He looked at the boy. Everett looked back at him. Harlan said, "Your mother is the best builder in this valley." He said it stiffly, with the awkwardness of someone delivering a sentence that their mouth is not used to forming. "I was wrong about her. I was wrong about a lot of things." Everett regarded him for a moment. "I know," Everett said. Harlan nodded once, jerkily, and walked out. Everett watched him go. Then he looked up at Norah. "That cost him something," she told her son quietly. Everett considered this. "Good," he said. And then, after a pause, with something more generous, "I suppose." Silas came to see her alone the day after. He came to the canyon, to the hollow, and stood outside it the way so many people had stood outside it over the past months, as if the tree itself required a moment of consideration before you approached it. He was carrying a leather case, flat and worn, the kind a careful man uses to transport documents. Norah came out of the hollow and stood before him. He held out the case. "The original deed," he said. "My father's letter. The survey records. Everything Aldous Webb will need to file the paperwork properly." He paused. "It's complete. I had my father's other papers brought from where he kept them. Everything is there." Norah took the case. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight. She thought about her husband in a collapsed tunnel, about the choice he had made without hesitation. She thought about Silas's father pressing careful letters into a page, trying to repay a debt the way honorable men do, not with money, but with something that would last. She thought about what Silas had lost by standing in Grover's store and saying what he had said. A certain kind of authority, a certain version of himself. Things that could not be rebuilt, at least not into the same shape. "Your father would have wanted you to do this," she said. Silas looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Not quite grief, not quite relief, but the complicated expression of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has just set it down and is still working out what his body feels like without it. "Yes," he said. "I expect he would have." He did not offer his hand. She did not offer hers. There was no formal closing. There was only this, the exchange of a leather case, the simple physics of something returning to where it belonged. He walked back through the canyon. She watched him until the trees took him. She stood in the canyon for a long time after he had gone. The cottonwood was behind her, patient as always. The creek ran somewhere beneath the snow. The land was hers. She was still learning what that meant. She went back inside and put the case on the stone shelf beside the stove. The paperwork took several weeks. Aldous handled most of it with the methodical competence of a man who has found a problem he can actually solve and is treating it with appropriate seriousness. He came to the canyon often, more often, Norah thought, than the paperwork strictly required. He brought updates and questions and periodically provisions, which he left near the entrance without comment in a pattern that had begun to resemble, with some precision, the bundles that Martha had left before him. Everett noticed. He noticed in the way of perceptive children who have decided a thing and are simply waiting for the adults to catch up. One afternoon, when Aldous had been there for some time, reviewing documents with Norah at the flat stone she had established as a working surface outside the hollow, Everett appeared with 2 cups of warm water, set one in front of each of them, and then walked away without saying anything. Norah looked at the cup. She looked at Aldous. He was looking at the cup, too, with an expression of mild surprise and a suppressed smile. "He's very direct," Aldous said. He is, Norah agreed. There was a pause. Outside the canyon walls, the winter was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to consider retreat. The cold was still absolute, but the light had changed, coming at a slightly different angle now, lasting a few minutes longer each day, the small arithmetic of a season turning. The land will be formally recorded in your name within the month, Aldous said. He looked at the documents on the stone. Then he looked at her. After that, I expect you'll have decisions to make. I will, she said. I'd like to be part of those decisions, he said, if that's acceptable to you. He said it with the careful plainness of a man who means what he says and is not interested in embellishing it into something larger or smaller than it is. Just the true thing, stated simply. Norah looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the cup of warm water in the deep hours of the storm's second night. She thought about Everett's single grave nod the first time Aldous had come to the canyon. She thought about her father, who had been, among many other things, a man who showed up and did the work without being asked. That's acceptable, she said. Aldous nodded. He picked up his cup and returned to the documents. Norah picked up hers and did the same. Spring would come. There was time. The teaching began before the snow had fully melted. It started with Grover, who had come back to the canyon on a mild afternoon with genuine questions and a willingness to be wrong about things he had previously been certain of. Norah walked him through the principles. Not the techniques first, but the principles, because her father had always said that techniques without principles were recipes that worked until they didn't. She showed him the clay walls. She pressed his hand flat against them, held it there, waited for his face to change when he felt the warmth radiating back. It changed every time. It didn't matter how much a person knew or how long they had been building things. That moment of first contact with a warm wall in the heart of winter produced the same expression in everyone. A kind of arrested wonder. A recalculation happening in real time. She showed him the stone floor and explained why the stones mattered, not just as a dry surface, but as additional mass, additional storage, additional warmth banked and held against the night. She walked him outside and showed him the berm of packed, decomposed wood against the outside walls, and explained what it did to the temperature of the roots, and why the roots mattered to the floor above them. She explained the chimney, the careful geometry of it, why the flue had to be narrow enough to draw, but not so narrow as to choke, why the clay around each stone mattered as much as the stones themselves. She explained the door, not just wood or wicker, but a layered construction that created a brief dead air space, an airlock effect that kept the outside cold from rushing in every time someone entered. She explained all of it the way her father had explained things to her, not as a list of steps to memorize, but as a way of seeing. Once you understood the principle, the technique followed naturally. Once you saw warmth as something to be stored rather than something to be generated, all the decisions that had previously seemed strange became obvious. Grover listened with the attention of a man who has recently been shown that he was wrong about something important and has decided to take the correction seriously. He told others. Others came. The settlement's builders came, some skeptically and some with open curiosity, and Norah showed them what she had done and explained why, and answered questions with the patience of a woman who understood that knowledge was only useful if it moved. She was not a teacher by training, but she was her father's daughter, and he had been the kind of man who could explain a complex thing simply, and she had absorbed that from him the way the clay walls had absorbed the fire's heat. Slowly, over time, until it was simply part of what she was. What struck her, watching these men touch the warm walls and recalculate, was how little had actually changed in the world. The cold was the same cold it had always been. The wood was the same wood. The clay was the same clay from the same creek bank. None of the materials were new. None of the principles were invented. They had been observed and tested and passed down through generations of people who lived close to the land and could not afford to be wrong about warmth. What had changed was simply what they were looking at. She had shown them a different question. Not how do I fight the cold, but how do I hold the warmth? The answer, once you asked the right question, was already there, patient and waiting, in every cubic foot of wood and stone and clay around them. Reverend Marsh came once. He came in the evening, alone, and stood outside the hollow for a moment before Norah acknowledged him. He was a different man than he had been before the storm, not dramatically different, not transformed, but worn down to something more genuine, the way wood is worn by water until the grain shows through. He had buried 2 of his congregation in the days after the storm. He had said the words. He had stood in the cold at 2 graves, and understood, she thought, what the cold had been trying to tell him. He did not apologize exactly. She had not expected him to. But he said, I spoke without understanding. What you built here. He stopped. He looked at the cottonwood, massive and unchanged and ancient. It is a thing I did not have the eyes to see. Norah considered him. Most things look like folly, she said. Before they work, he nodded slowly. Then he walked back through the canyon. She decided she did not need to know what to do with Reverend Marsh entirely. Some things resolved completely, and some things simply reached a different place, and both of those were acceptable. It was a spring evening when Aldous asked her to marry him. Not a dramatic evening, an ordinary one, the kind that accumulates in a life without announcing itself as significant. Everett had gone to bed early, which Norah suspected was not accidental. Timber was asleep by the stove, his legs twitching with whatever dogs dream about. The hollow was warm in the way it was warm in the evenings now. Not the desperate warmth of survival, but the comfortable warmth of a home that had been lived in long enough to know how its occupants breathed. Aldous asked without preamble. He said he had been thinking about it for some time, and he believed they suited each other well, and he would like, if she was willing, to spend the rest of his life being useful to her in whatever way she would accept. Norah listened to this. She thought it was, probably, the most honest proposal she had ever heard, which was not surprising given who was making it. Everett approves, she said. I know, Aldous said. He told me. She looked at him. He told you? He came to find me in the settlement and told me, very directly, that he thought it would be a good arrangement and that I should get on with it. He paused. He used exactly those words. Get on with it. Norah was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed. A real laugh. The kind that surprised her, coming from somewhere unguarded. She had not laughed like that in a long time. She had forgotten the physical sensation of it, the way it moved through the chest. Yes, she said, when the laughing had settled. It would be a good arrangement. Yes, he said. Yes, she said. Timber's tail moved once without the rest of him waking up. The years that followed were not without difficulty. No years are. But they had a quality that Norah had not known she was waiting for until she felt it. The quality of continuity, of things building on each other rather than being taken away. The hollow remained her home, and then their home, as more space was added carefully alongside it, not replacing what she had built, but extending from it. The new structure learning from the principles of the old. The extended walls used the same clay lining, the same stone floors, the same patient approach to heat. What had been a single rough chamber became, over the years, a house unlike any other in the settlement. Low-ceilinged, earth-bermed, its rooms curving around the original hollow, the way growth curves around a wound, incorporating it rather than hiding it. People came from neighboring settlements to see it. Some came skeptically and left converted. Some came convinced and left with measurements and notes. A few came, as people sometimes do, simply to stand inside something that worked and feel, for a moment, the satisfaction of a principle made physical. Other homes in the settlement and beyond began to incorporate what she had taught, slowly and imperfectly at first, and then with greater confidence as understanding deepened. Silas Drum, who never again spoke directly to Norah about the land or the deed or the winter, but whose presence at the edge of her teaching sessions became, over time, a fixture, applied the principles to the new cabins he built for families displaced by the storm's damage. He was a skilled enough craftsman to improve on what she had shown him, adding refinements she had not thought of, and he shared those refinements with her without ceremony, the way people share tools. It was not a friendship, but it was something. Everett grew up with the confidence of a child who has watched his parent navigate the worst and come through it with her principles intact. He had her watchful quality, her stillness, and he carried them into adulthood with the addition of his own considerable precision of mind. He went to study, eventually, engineering in a distant city, and came back with formal language for things he had known since he was 9 years old, setting snares along a frozen creek. He learned that the oldest knowledge and the newest knowledge were often talking about the same thing. He spent his career building structures, and every one of them incorporated the principles his mother had learned from her father, formalized now into engineering language, but unchanged in their essential nature. He taught those principles to younger engineers, and they passed them on. And the chain of knowledge that had begun with a forester in the old country extended itself outward in ways that could no longer be traced back to a single woman and a hollow tree in a canyon, but that were nonetheless rooted there, in that cold winter, in those clay-lined walls. A daughter came, a small, fierce creature, who arrived in the spring, and whom Norah and Aldous named Wren, after the small birds her father had loved, the birds that sang from the inside of thickets where you could hear them perfectly, but never quite see them. Wren grew up in the hollow and the extended house and the canyon that was hers by birth and by belonging, and she learned everything her mother knew and went looking for more, and eventually wrote it all down in a book that Norah would hold in her hands when it was finished and feel, turning the pages, the satisfaction of a chain completed. Martha Hale lived into a good age. She and Norah never spoke again of the debt or the offer or the choice she had made and then unmade. They became instead the kind of friends that older women sometimes become, practical, honest, unromantic about each other's flaws, deeply reliable. Martha was the first person Norah told about Wren. Martha was in the room when Wren was born. Some things resolve not by being discussed, but by being lived past. On his last good morning, Timber walked to the entrance of the hollow on his own, slowly, with the deliberate care of an old dog who knows what he wants, and lay down in a patch of sunlight. Everett sat beside him. Neither of them moved for a long time. He died that afternoon, on his side in the sun near the hollow's entrance, his breathing becoming slower and slower, and then simply not continuing. Everett was there, and Wren and Aldous. They sat with him until it was over. Wren, who was 10 and not given to easy emotion, cried without trying to stop herself, which Norah thought was exactly right. They buried him under the cottonwood, between two roots that curved out from the base like arms. Everett carved the stone himself. He worked on it for 2 evenings before he was satisfied, and when he set it in the ground, it read, in letters he had cut with care. He was never afraid. Norah stood at the grave for a while after the others had gone inside. She put her hand on the bark of the cottonwood above the stone. The tree was warm, still warm, impossibly warm. The warmth of something that had been patiently holding what it was given since long before any of them were born. She thought about her father, about a man who had pressed his palm against the bark of an old tree and listened to what it had to say. She thought about a young miner who had gone back into a collapsed tunnel. She thought about a woman whose name was carved into this bark, a woman she had never met, who had survived a hard winter in this same hollow, who had left her name as a record and a message, and perhaps an invitation. She pressed her palm flat against the bark, still warm, still holding. It was Wren's daughter who asked the question, years later, on a summer evening when the hollow had been part of the landscape long enough that the children of the settlement could not quite remember when it hadn't been. She was a small girl of perhaps 7, solemn, curious, with the watchful quality that appeared in that family, the way certain features appear in families, generation after generation, regardless of what else changed. She stood beside Norah on the porch that had been built along the hollow's southern side, looking at the great cottonwood. The evening light fell across the tree at an angle that made it look, briefly, like something lit from within. The bark warm-colored, the great trunk casting a long shadow across the cleared ground where Everett had learned to set his first snares, where Timber had spent his last good morning in the sun. "Great-grandma," the girl said, "were you really scared, that first night?" Norah looked at the tree, at the bark she had touched 1,000 times in winter and summer and every season between, at the fissure that had been a doorway, that had been a home, that had been, in the end, a beginning. "I was terrified," she said. "I didn't know if we would live through it. I didn't know if I was doing the right thing or simply the only thing." She paused. Those can feel very similar when you're in the middle of them. The girl considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "But you went in anyway." "I went in anyway," Norah agreed, "because there was nowhere else to go. And because I remembered something my father had told me about that tree, about trees like it. And I thought, if he was right, we might survive. And if he was wrong, we wouldn't survive anywhere else either. So the risk was the same either way. All that was different was whether I tried." The girl thought about this for a moment. "What made you think he was right?" she asked. Norah smiled. It was a question she had not expected. The question underneath the question, the one that required the real answer. "I didn't," she said. "I hoped he was right. But what I knew, what I was certain of, was that he had spent his whole life paying attention to trees. And when someone spends their whole life paying attention to something, they learn things that can't be explained in a few words. I trusted the attention even when I couldn't verify the answer. She looked down at the girl. Your great-grandfather paid attention, she said, to wood and cold and warmth and the way living things survive. And he taught me what he noticed. And that is what I carried into the tree that night. Not certainty, just what someone who loved me had taken the trouble to learn. The girl was quiet for a moment, looking at the tree. What made you go inside? She said. It was the same question in different words, but Norah understood she was asking for a different part of it. I remembered your great-great-grandfather's voice, she said. He used to say, the oldest things know how to survive the longest. I didn't know if he was right, but I remembered him saying it. And that was enough to take one more step. The girl looked at the tree. Then she looked at Norah. Will you teach me? She said. What he taught you. Norah looked at this small, solemn face, at the watchful eyes, at the quality of attention that was, she thought, the most reliable thing that passed from one generation to the next, more reliable than land or money, or any of the things that could be taken away. Yes, my darling, she said, I will teach you everything. The family had placed a small wooden board beside the entrance to the hollow years before. Not an official marker, just a piece of pine, sanded smooth by Everett's own hands and carved simply with the words, Norah Vance lived here. She did not fight the winter. She learned to carry its weight. The cottonwood stood behind them, ancient and unhurried, its walls holding the warmth of every fire that had ever burned inside it. All the winters, all the people, all the knowledge passed from hand to hand across the long chain of years. The oldest things know how to survive the longest. If you are facing your own storm right now, your own hollow tree, your own frozen night, your own settlement of closed windows, remember her. Remember that the warmth is not something that comes from outside. It is something you build, slowly and patiently, in the walls of the place you have decided to call home, and it will hold. Long after the fire goes low, it will hold.